Howard is going to man the app and take your questions. I'm just joking. So please, if you have questions, all right, you're right. I missed your one question. I breezed past. I didn't actually address your question because I breezed past it.
What are some things I should be doing? Whether it's in my part or the kids' part, what are some things I should be looking for to increase my value added score?
Well, I think that, I can't give you a teaching clinic because I'm not a teacher. You guys would know this better than I am. What I will do is answer your question by saying that's a big problem with the use of value added in evaluations, which is that it's a big problem depending on how you look at it. So on the one hand, value added scores are purely summative, right? They don't tell you much of anything about why you got the score you got, what you're supposed to do about it, how you vary your instructional practice leads to a different value added score. We did present some evidence in the relationship between observations and value added, and the relationships were kind of weak, suggesting maybe, at least insofar as instructional practice is measured by these observational protocols, there's not a very strong relationship, but this is a big problem for value added, and I hear this a lot, and it's a fair point to say this is summative, it's not helping teachers improve, it's not telling them how to improve, and so it doesn't belong in evaluations. I think that I can understand that reaction. On the other hand, it's not entirely clear to me why summative measures have no role in performance evaluations, right? It's not clear to me why a measure necessarily needs to be formative to have some legitimate role in an evaluation. It is, after all, a performance evaluation. To have some kind of outcome-based measure would seem to me to be appropriate. But to answer your question, I don't know. I don't think that anyone can really answer that question particularly strongly at this point. I think that there are ways to get into this in terms of, for example, videotaping teachers or observing them, seeing what they do, seeing if that's associated with changes in value-added scores. I mean, I can conceive of ways to test that, and I think it's being done on a limited scale, but it's an extraordinarily difficult question to answer. And so my answer to you is, that what you're asking, there's no answer, and that's very important, is that these measures are purely summative. So I'm sorry that you waited all this time for me to not answer your question, but that's how I operate. Howard. All right, we have a related question? Okay.
Yeah. So the point Matt didn't really make is that value-added research is a really good research technique when you have gobs of teachers. And there are findings from this research that can give you guidance, or your principal guidance on what to do and what not to do. I'll give you one example. It's quite common for principals to say, I'm going to move your grade from 2nd to 6th grade, keep you fresh. And the principal actually believes that. Well, there's research, multiple value-added studies that show it's just like any other kind of teacher mobility. It takes a year or two to catch on to a new preparation and a new age group of kids. So it doesn't help you out as an individual to improve, but value-added research can give guidance.
Well, I would just, I'm sorry.
How to run schools better and manage teachers.
I would add that Matt did make that point right at the very beginning. Thank you, Mem. Also, I think that what you're talking about, like moving teachers between grades, or even there's some recent evidence about having teachers teach certain types of students or certain grades, certain subjects. That's one way to kind of shuffle around your workforce within a school based on value added. But that's important, and I think that that's worth mentioning, and I could have mentioned it. It's also not exactly kind of how do I change my instructional practice. It's more like where am I teaching than it is how am I teaching. But yeah, point well taken, Howard. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Familiar with PS?
Then you have one.
Behind me? Someone else? Okay, sorry. I thought you'd call me.
All right, she yields the floor to her very able, learned, and distinguished colleague from Minnesota.
Oh, no, I have to sound smart. Okay.
Madam President.
In Minneapolis, I'm not sure if you're familiar with David Heisted and VARC out of Wisconsin, value-added review. We tried to take some of the things that you're talking about here and look for poverty, look for other impacts make it a better model. And he would take and be able to tell in a year's time which second grade classroom had the best team, you know, second grade team in the district had the best reading results, and then we should look at their strategies. And he's a lovely man and he's really smart, and we felt it was a better process. But looking back, I'm wondering, is it just more of all of what you've been talking about here? Is VARC a valuable model? Have you heard about it? Is it improved from Saunders' model?
It's tough for me to like say which models are better or worse. I think that they're all trade-offs. I would say that from what I've seen of the VARC model, that it's one that I would think that I would endorse personally. I think that you also make a great point about there is some kind of diagnostic value in saying, you know, this teacher got a high score, so we should look at what she was doing. On the other hand, I would temper that enthusiasm, because I always temper my enthusiasm, because I don't like enthusiasm. It makes me very uncomfortable. But I would temper that enthusiasm by saying, don't necessarily read too much into one teacher's.
No, there was a whole team of second grade teachers.
Okay, so this was over a school, or?
Yeah, in a school. We did the whole second grade level across the district.
So there is that kind of diagnostic potential where you can say who has the high scores, and then kind of look at them to see what they're doing. But that's kind of ad hoc. Yes, and I think that that's also worth saying in terms of you can kind of wring some formative value out of value-added estimates by doing things like that. Yes, ma'am. Finally, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So here's what I gathered in general, that there are different issues with different VAM models, that there are different ways in which VAM models are used and misused, that it can point, a given VAM model can point to an issue that may, with the teacher's teaching, that may need further investigation over time. That for me, the big problem with this model used in teacher evaluation is attaching high stakes to it, which is really the evil part of everything. So it makes me wonder this, and it's kind of, I think, somewhat what you were talking about with Lynn. So a gun is not necessarily an evil tool until you use it for evil. So we advocate for gun control. Is there anything in the field that is advocating for VAM control? So that how we use it and the variability in models can in some way be talked about rather than VAM being a generic term?
Well, first I would recommend that you keep your value-added models in locked safety boxes at all times. I think that there are certain trigger guards that you can put on the model which require a key, or you can't estimate the model. The important focus here that I've been talking about today is value-added in this specific context of attaching stakes, putting it into an evaluation system and attaching stakes. That's a completely different ballgame than the way value-added is often discussed. And by the way, it's a completely different ballgame from just looking at the research on value-added. And like I said, a lot of people conflate those two uses, and it causes a lot of confusion. As for kind of best practices, I am hesitant to give my opinion on whether there should be some safety valves. I think that I have tried to, it's in the spirit of trade unionism and teaching that I've tried to kind of present both sides here. But certainly I've suggested some things that you can do. For example, don't put too much trust on 1 year of estimates based on a small sample of students. Pay attention to error margins, all the things that I discussed here today. In terms of, are there things that I absolutely would not do with value added? Like, they're the equivalent of, having guns all over and people can just pick them up and use them. Which is a wonderful analogy. I'm very comfortable with it. I certainly would not weight them beyond, in evaluations, I certainly would not weight them beyond where they've been weighted. I think maybe they're actually weighted a little too high in some places. I would not weight or incorporate value added in a manner to produce a certain distribution of results. One of the things I wanted to discuss here is that is that using value-added, weighting it more highly will predict value-added better in the future, but it also has the practical implication of introducing more variation into the results for teachers. Because unlike observations, where every single teacher can get the same observation score theoretically, value-added imposes, is normative, inherently normative, and imposes a distribution, imposes variation on teachers. And so the way these new evaluations are turning out, increasing the weight assigned to value-added will effectively not only increase the variation in final scores, but tend to depress them down, which is because observation scores we're seeing, tended to be quite high. I would not increase the weight or make any weighting decisions or make any decisions about value added in order to produce a specific distribution of results. What's that?
We just get rid of it.
Well, I know that, listen, I understand that sentiment. I also am not here to give you my opinion. And like I said, I think at this point, at least not directly, I can imply my opinion. It's very subtle. I'm a subtle guy. At this point, like I said, I think you guys probably would know more about how this is going to turn out than I would. But I do think that if used properly and responsibly as a minority component of evaluation, there's a lot of potential there. I would not say just dump it. I personally would not say that, with all due respect to those who have dissenting opinions on that. Like I said, it's all about how you're using it, not.
So we used to use it for, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Please.
I was going to ask you to, I'm from London and we have different models of value added in different parts of England.
Really?
Lots of people were talking about, it's very interesting, and unfortunately this kind of level of detail doesn't get to teachers, right? So you said, of course teachers there'll be a credibility issue, because once teachers get to know this, they'll be like, there's a huge room for error, I didn't know that. The trouble is this doesn't get to the teacher, so teachers don't end up understanding there's a room for error, and teachers can end up feeling that there is this absolutely unchangeable data that is correct. There are numerical scores that are attached that are, not part of a dialogue, not part of discussion.
It's very interesting that you say that this is. I didn't actually know.
So teachers need to be part of the debate about the policy application of this. And also, I think the findings you had about the bias when you're looking at who's in front of the teacher, different classes and different rates of progress that can be expected, and teachers being able to be empowered by understanding that, of course, we know different pupils make different rates of progress, and that can be valid, that can be okay. So that how we use these measures will be part of ongoing discussion debate all the time, so they're not just applied to teachers, so that it is a kind of I think what you know about the worldwide context is tricky to be able to get this information to them.
You'll notice that I tried to interrupt you twice. It's because every 5 or 10 seconds you were talking, you brought up something really important that I want to respond to, and I think I forgot about half of them. So it was a great comment, and I forgot a lot of the things I wanted to say in response. So thanks a lot. Wonderful comment. I had no idea that there were formal value-added models in London. Congratulations. Welcome aboard. In terms of the information that goes to teachers in terms of the strengths and limitations, there is a disincentive to hold that back, right? To not get into that too much if you are advocating for using value added. I think that one of the things that happened in the US that made a huge difference was the Los Angeles Times, followed by the New York City newspapers, published teachers' names and value added scores. And I think that incident, more than any other single incident, I could be wrong, this is just in the back of my head, those two incidents more than any other created this rash of information about the strengths and limitations of value added and got everybody, whereas before it was just kind of obscure. Like when I did this presentation in 2011 at Teach, it was a completely different context. It was this kind of obscure thing. Some people had heard of it, they had it. Now it's like everybody has it. And the information after those publications, I think really made the difference. This is the point at which I forget all the things that I wanted to say in response to your wonderful comment. The idea that different students make different rates of progress. It's funny to me because you'll often hear people say, no, value added is wrong because students, are not all the same. They don't, they make different rates of progress. We can't control for everything. The latter is true, but the truth is that value-added models are specifically designed to address those differences imperfectly, and partially, to be sure. All right, you can't do that, perfectly. And even, if you talk about it at the aggregate level and say this model's pretty good at addressing them, even if you do it very well at the aggregate level, when you move down to individual teachers, you're going to have mistakes and you're going to have trouble identifying which are mistakes and which aren't. But so many of the arguments that I hear against value added are actually kind of strengths in its approach, as opposed to, by the way, like I said earlier, No Child Left Behind, where it's not teachers, all right, but it's schools. Your school is being judged based on how high or low, based on your proficiency rates, essentially, based on how high or low your students score, which is almost entirely out of the hands, not a function of the instructional effectiveness of a school or a district. And so it's nice to hear folks say that they would respond positively when you hear things like that, where it is okay to say not all students make the same rates of progress. It is a strength of value added. Now I've officially forgotten. I had about 2 or 3 other responses. But thank you very much for your comment, and good luck with the value added thing. I'm just kidding. It's going to be a hell of a ride.
Wait, you want coasting schools?
Coasting?
Coasting.
C-O-A-S-T?
Schools are going to be labeled as coasting.
It's very catchy. Yes, ma'am.
Does the test matter that you're using? Like, are there some tests that are constructed well and lend itself to fewer errors given a certain model, and other tests that are not constructed well? Does the strength of the tool used to get the value added score matter?
Yes, the test, the quality of the test, which test you use, can make anywhere from a significant difference, statistically speaking, to a very large difference in who gets what score. Okay, so these results do vary. I had a slide on that at some point, but I took it out in favor of another slide. So thank you for asking the question. Yes, the test does matter. The value-added estimates can vary by the test, can vary, by the way, by the stakes attached to a test. And that's, by the way, another suggestion that I would make in terms of districts designing things would be to put in a low-stakes test of a representative sample every year. So the test does matter. As to whether some tests are better than others for the value-added, in the value-added context, the answer is yes, with the follow-up answer that I'm not a psychometrician. I am not sure how to give you advice on which tests are better, which specific tests are better and which aren't. I haven't kind of surveyed the landscape in that sense. Howard, do you have any? Of course you do. Please.
Yeah. Well, the obvious one is you need a test that offers a wide variety of questions for your. So there's some tough questions for your really good students and some easy questions for your out of grade level questions for your not so good scoring students. So you can measure achievement gain for your low scoring students and your high scoring students. So if you get a test where you're teaching 4th grade and all the questions are at the 4th grade level, you're not going to detect learning of the students at the end of the distribution.
But you don't have specific tests. Yes, that's very true. Also, I would just add, by the way, that testing tests vary in terms of the utility of the content that they sample, whether you're teaching content that's tied to longer term outcomes, that's useful to students, whether the curriculum that you use within schools is aligned with the standards and thus aligned with the test, whether all of that is in line. So there are general recommendations. And by the way, we're getting new tests almost everywhere.
Yeah. Well, and that leads me to kind of the second half of my question. The teachers in my state, we have one of the, in my opinion, worst examples of use of value-added methodology. And one of the things that keeps happening, of course, is that they're comparing with different tests every single year. So to us as teachers, it's common sense that you can't say, last year here's your BAM score with this test, and this year here's your BAM score with this test.
I'm sorry, they're using different tests in consecutive years? Did I hear that?
Yes, sir.
That's as a matter of policy? I mean, it could happen once if you switch tests.
It happens all the time.
Okay, well, that's...
This is part of the craziness.
Well, that's
Like 11th grade math compared to 8th grade math scores.
that's a different issue than completely revamping the test, no? But the idea with the Common Core test is we should talk about that after. Let's have a talk afterwards. We need to talk. But the idea with the Common Core, which I just wanted to address very quickly, is that is an extreme example of a completely new test with completely new standards coming in. And thankfully, to their credit, districts, even super pro evaluation, value-added states and districts have tended to say, you know what, we're going to back off for a year or two.
Except for ours.
Really? Well, at this point, what's the difference, right? You know.
So it's,
Is there another question? No one's before you.
oh, you just don't want to talk to me, Matthew.
Well, I'm trying to get a diversity of voices. Please.
So one of the things that you showed was the difference in the kind of student that you teach. One of the things, and I have a science background, so my idea was, so why don't you pull the data of teachers that move from different
Right.
schools? Is there research behind that?
Absolutely. And there's the idea of teachers that switch between schools. So if you go, if you're effective in one school and then you switch to a different school, is that effectiveness, measured by value-added scores anyway, portable? And yes, there's even a recent study that did that in terms of with random assignment. And the results are that suggest that yes, there is, as always with value-added, you know, it's not like yes or no. It's always a matter of degree, but the results were that there is a statistically discernible kind of matchup when you switch schools. I would argue that the magnitude of the relationship is educationally meaningful, but it's certainly far from perfect, and it varies, by the way, between grades, like whether you're a middle school teacher or an elementary school teacher, which makes sense. But yes, excellent point. There are ways that you can kind of test the validity. I mentioned this briefly. There are ways to kind of test validity like that, which is like, if teachers switch schools, do they bring their effectiveness with them? But on the other hand, and those are great tests and I love them, on the other hand, of course, there is that circularity, right? So it's, does value-added predict itself, which is not exactly the same thing of, is this telling us what we want to know? But excellent point, sir, and then Lynn.
Just given that there are different growth models and that there are different levels of stability among those different growth models, why would a state choose the least stable model?
Okay, the stability.
I'm sorry, and how would one know which model your state employs?
Stability, first of all, is more a function of sample size than of model choice. There are modest differences in stability between models. The big thing with model choice is things like the relationship between the estimates and student characteristics. So it was kind of like, is there a relationship between the students you teach and the value-added scores you get in terms of model choice? I think that's what you meant. But anyway, the point that why would you choose models that are, for example, those growth percentile models? There's a stronger association between student characteristics and value added in those median growth percentile models, which many states are using and you've probably heard of at some point. Now again, before I answer, just the caveat, some of that association is real. It may be the case that all of it is real. There may actually be, in reality, a modest association between student characteristics at the school level and teacher effectiveness, at least at the school level. However, why would states choose it? I've actually struggled with this question myself. I feel like the growth percentile models are simpler, easier to explain. I think in some cases people are under strange notions that they've somehow solved some problems. I've heard some people say that at the state level, which is weird, right, Howard? And that I don't understand, but I think that there's a tremendous appeal in the simplicity of those models, in the fact that they spit out the kind of median. I mean, I can explain to you what a growth percentile model does like that in one sentence, whereas you can't do that with the other models. Beyond that, I think valuations is like one of those weird situations where nobody really knows what to do, but everyone's kind of looking around and doing the same thing, like when you're teenagers and you're looking around at what other people are doing. And I think a couple of states did that, and then everybody kind of jumped on that bandwagon. But beyond that, I'm really not sure why they're choosing those models. I think the simplicity, I think the kind of isomorphism, beyond that, it's tough for me to say. I'm not in those rooms, in those decisions, but I think it's a very good question. Lynn, ma'am?
We did value added for 20 years before teacher evaluation, and we used it by saying, look at these 10, 15, 20 schools that made this great growth. And then we'd have a big event, and people could come and learn from the schools, like, what did you do? What did you do for me? What are you doing in math? And it was fabulous, and we printed little booklets, and we shared all this stuff. Then when it moved into teacher evaluation, all that was lost. So it's like what Lyle just asked you, what can we learn? What are the instructional strategies we're supposed to use? All we get is a score on a scale, and you can't really tell what the growth was all about. So do you know anyone anywhere that's using this in a positive way like we used to use it, but now on an individual level by helping teachers actually look for why the growth is happening or not happening, what strategy is there anybody that's doing a collective vision of using this? Otherwise, you don't want to throw it out.
First of all, leave it to the Minnesotans to implement value added, and they say, we're putting in value added, and then we're going to have a party. And it's going to be great.
It was very good.
It's very Minnesota-esque. Is anybody doing this in a positive way? Look, these things are, I would not characterize what's happening with value added and evaluations right now as necessarily negative. I think it varies a lot by state. So just using it, I wouldn't call it negative, okay? I think that there are some places where it's being used more responsibly than others. As far as, and I think that, that's just within the evaluation context. So that's the high stakes use, right? In terms of what you're talking about, which is basically low stakes use, right? Yes, that's happening. That's happening, often simultaneously with the high stakes use. At the very least, teachers are getting this information. Principals are getting this information. There's interesting research looking at whether people actually even pay attention to this stuff. It seems that principals do, and there are a couple of great studies about teachers who were given this information pre-evaluations, totally low stakes, no stakes, and teachers just pretty much ignored it. It was available on a website, and very low proportions of them even signed into the website at any point when the information was available. But certainly giving it to teachers is a I guess a potentially productive use of it. And there's a lot of stuff going on, I guess, at the school level, which to me is also different from the teacher level, even in the high stakes accountability sense, where you're talking about identifying effective schools, right, and then having a party.
No, it wasn't a party. Come on.
Oh, come on! I want to characterize it as a party.
I mean, I'm having a hard time going back to say this is something useful for us, especially if we can't decide what kinds of instructional strategies we could shift to or change to or learn from to help people. If we're just getting a score.
I respect that viewpoint. On the other hand, like I said, we're talking about a performance evaluation here. And not necessarily, to me, doesn't necessarily follow that everything in a performance evaluation need be formative. That you can't have any component that's purely summative. On the other hand, I fully get what you're saying. It is a big problem. It's a big problem not only in terms of the logistics of the use of this, it's also a big problem in terms of credibility. I mean, teachers don't like things that say, here's your score, no idea why, can't really tell you much about how to change it. And by the way, just the belief on the part of teachers that they can affect their score, not even necessarily how to do it, but that there's anything they can do. That's also very important. And if teachers think there's nothing that they can do, then that is a big threat to the credibility of the measures. So I'm sorry that I can't give you anything to go back to Minneapolis, and you can talk about at the parties that you have for the high value-added schools. Okay, so I've achieved my goals in this presentation. I've gotten a shut up from the audience. Thank you, Lynn. I think that we are out of time. Howard is just dying to get up and leave. So thank you very much. Always my privilege. I'll be here for a while if you want to talk.